My first memory is my sister's 3rd birthday. In anger, my father hurt me because I kept touching my sister's puzzle. I was 18 months old. The extent of abuse from my father was both physical and verbal. It dictated my behavior and the way I felt about myself, even through my early adult years. Growing up, I guess we seemed like a normal family to most. When I was young, we did go to church, but that wasn't reflected in our home life. It was normal for me to pick out clothes that covered bruises or to endure cruel words. Certain phrases are burned in my memory. You're worthless and you'll never amount to anything. I wish you would leave home and never come back. If we get a divorce, it'll be all your fault. When I was in junior high and high school, I went to church on my own and became saved, but I didn't understand a relationship with Christ or how to allow the Lord's guidance in my life. I do remember knowing that I was different on the inside than my father was telling me I was. After verbal assaults and punishments that were particularly cruel, I used to sit in my room and think life would be so much better if my father weren't alive. My friends all had great dads, and I didn't understand how I got this one. I endured my father's physical abuse through my early 20s until I moved out of the house. At one point, he apologized, but continued to be very critical. I just didn't know how I could ever forgive him. After becoming a parent myself and returning to church, I learned who God said I was, and I claimed my value in Him. Sometimes I would talk to my dad about God. He said he knew he was going to heaven because he was a good man. I just thought that was so absurd. Years later, when my father began to show signs of dementia, I started to worry. Even though I used to wish he was dead, he was still my father, and I wondered how I would handle his death, knowing that he was suffering for eternity. The Lord gave me a true burden for my father's salvation. He allowed me to see my father as an individual, a child of God who deserved the same joy I had found. My father lived angry most of his life and was even abused himself. I looked for every opportunity to talk to my dad about salvation. He knew he was ill and even began to think about death himself. He would mention going to see his people, which meant going to heaven. A few weeks before my father's death, I felt very strongly about having Alex come and speak to him. I was nervous because Dad didn't care for the church, but he was receptive to Alex, his explanation about salvation and prayer. He couldn't speak much anymore. But when my dad took my hand for prayer, it gave me hope that he had accepted forgiveness. Through this, the Lord also allowed me to forgive my father. That day, the Lord gave me peace about my father's pending death, and a few weeks later, even gave me the privilege of praying over him minutes before he took his last breath. Sometime later, I had this thought. What if God didn't pick him as my father, but picked me as his daughter?